thank you everybody for joining us today and for sticking with us for the second half of our event tonight. And happy Earth Week to everybody. The second part of the discussion is going to dive a little bit deeper into the changes that are going to come in both the long and the short term to climate action as a result of the economic and social challenges created by COVID-19. 2020 was shaping up to be a pivotal year for climate action. Renewable energy deployment continued to grow around the world. Companies across many sectors were beginning to step up with significant climate action pledges. The US Democratic primary had placed more emphasis on climate change than any previous election. It was also the year that was supposed to see updated commitments from the international community building on the Paris Climate Pact and showing concrete plans for further reductions in global emissions. Then the bottom fell out. First in China and then around the world, economies stopped, governments went into crisis mode to handle the COVID outbreak. Oil prices have plummeted, renewable energy contracts have been put on hold. Corporate and government leaders around the world focused on the urgent issues created by the pandemic. Some places, like California, renewed their commitment to sustainability as they responded to the crisis, but others did not. The COP26 conference, scheduled for November of this year, has been postponed, and those countries like Japan that have released updated climate plans have left a lot on the table. Those of us whose careers are focused on climate change as a threat to society have been wondering what will happen to the momentum that we finally seem to have been gathering. Every day as I read the news, I see roughly equal numbers of articles that claim the COVID response will destroy climate action, and ones that take the opposite stance and claim that the response to COVID demonstrates that we can succeed in the fight against climate change. This panel will give us a chance to discuss what we know and what we don't know of the economic and the political landscape in the short and long term, from both our current data and from historical perspectives. It also gives us a welcome chance to change out of our pajamas. I'm happy to have with me two experts from our division of Humanities and Social Sciences here at Caltech, Professor Jean-Laurent Rosenthal and Mike Alvarez. Thank you both for being here. There we go. So I thought we could start with some of the short-term changes that we've been seeing, both leading up to and during the global shutdown as a result of the coronavirus, decreasing oil prices, interest rate cuts, changes in energy usage. What does this mean for the prospects for renewable energy deployment, both now and whenever we do start our recovery? How applicable are the lessons that we've learned from historical downturns to today's results? And should we buy oil at $- and just pump it right back into the ground now while we can? So Jean-Laurent, why don't we start with you?
So energy use as a whole is a complicated issue because it's an input into a variety of things. So I'm going to talk briefly about what's happening with electricity. First, because we get very real short, immediate evidence about what's happened to electricity demand. And Neil, if you can put up the first slide, that'd be great. And during the COVID crisis, with the stay-at-home orders across Europe, you've seen these, and that's what's on the left side of this panel, these very large-scale decline in electrical energy demand across different countries. Of course, Italy, which had the most severe stay-at-home orders, had this huge, almost 30% decline in electricity consumption. But a lot of countries are at 10 or 15%. And to give you a sense of scale is, for a lot of countries recently, energy's been growing more slowly than the economy, but roughly at the same pace. That's the first order of magnitude. So these are very, very large changes. And they're giving a sense to people about how severe the contractions are going to be. So that's on the demand side. So we know that there's right now very significant reductions in peak load demands, as well as reductions in the across the day variation. And this is thanks for Neil for reminding me this is on the right side of the slide, which a lot of this has to do with reduced commercial industrial demand. The second issue is over the next couple of years, aggregate demand for energy is going to go down because even if the airlines were to reopen right away, not all of us are going to start flying again. One is because we're probably going to take our leisure in different ways, probably because businesses that are going to be facing tough balance sheet situations are going to tell a lot of their CEOs that, travel may be something they want to massively reduce. there are other areas of the economy that are similarly going to be less demanders of energy. So there's going to be a smaller demand for energy in the aggregate, which means essentially low energy prices. In the longer term, we're pretty confident that we'll surmount this crisis, that demand will recover because growth has essentially been energy intensive for the last several hundred years. And so the only question is, can we produce this energy in sustainable ways, which is essentially the next piece of the challenge. And so the big frontier that we were hoping for this year was coming from this really massive decline in the cost of solar panels. You know, there's certainly in terms of renewables, there's wind, but wind is a complicated issue in terms of places where it'll happen. There's large amounts of the globe where you can put solar panels on. And the last time I flew up over to the Bay Area, you could fly over the Central Valley and you could see the rise of solar farms in places where people have pulled out their almond trees. And you know, this is good because solar farms don't consume water and they produce electricity on a clean basis. But then if you go to the next slide, you'll see just how little renewables are in the electrical production. And so I started in 2014 because that's roughly when solar starts to be visible as a hairline. The dark blue at the top is solar. What you can see is, in fact, what's the history of electrical production has been a substitution of natural gas. Coal has gone out and been replaced by natural gas. And then, you know, renewables have increased, but we were hoping that would actually come a little later. And if you go to the next slide, you'll see that happening. This is when you pull out all of the fossil fuels and nuclear, you can see that there's growth in both wind and solar. So how do we want to think about this now that we're facing a massive contraction? So this essentially has to do with how the supply sector for electricity is going to be reconfigured. So what's important about renewables is that they're the most robust sector of this part of the economy, because renewables are almost a pure capital good. So think about a solar field that you've put in place. Once you put it in place, you know, you got some maintenance, but in the solar panels are very young, so their initial maintenance costs over the next couple of years are very, very small, and your energy source is free. So it may turn out that the equity value of your firm goes negative, then somebody will repossess, they'll have to write down the bonds, but then there'll be a reconfiguration, but there's no reason to stop producing electricity. So the fact is, we don't exactly know what the value of these solar fields are, but they will continue to produce solar power. The problem for coal or, you know, fuel oil generators or natural gas being the big piece of this, is you have both a capital cost. You got to keep maintaining these plants. The plants are older, they require more maintenance, but you've got this variable energy cost. And so the question is, what's happening to these costs? And so this is sort of relatively recent data that I pulled off from Yahoo Finance. So the yellow piece is these are actually deflated. Actually, I can't remember. These are relative prices. So the yellow line is the retail price of electricity. So you'll notice that's relatively flat. And then you'll notice that natural gas essentially has its last big peak in 2007. Oil, which is more variable, has its last real peak around 2014. And they've been going down. And this is before the last couple months. So you'll notice that oil prices are still relatively high to what they are recently. So what does that mean? It means that for a natural gas producer, continuing to produce by your plant when natural gas has become easier because your variable cost has gotten a little easier, but you're not as competitive as a solar plant or a wind farm because they have no variable input. So what's going to happen over the next few months is the oldest plants in the sector that involves variable costs, which is largely coal and natural gas, are going to get shut down. That's how we're going to meet the demand reduction. So that's going to be good for the aggregate carbon footprint of electricity sector, because we're not going to reduce the renewable output, but we're going to reduce the carbon producing output. So that's the short run result. The long run issue is a little bit more subtle, because in the long run, we have to think about what will happen when demand starts to grow again, so this could be by winter time, it could be later, and in particular in winter time, renewables don't do so well. And so one possibility is we're going to meet this by starting to build more and more renewable plants. So add more wind capacity, add more solar farms. And there again, the relative price says there's the last piece that you want to look at, which is the gray line that's on this picture, which is a 10-year treasury yield, which is a good proxy for the cost of capital. And so one thing that's happened is solar investments have gotten cheaper because essentially you have to buy the whole plant now. You can borrow the money to do it, but your interest costs to do that have actually fallen pretty dramatically. And one thing that we've learned since 2008 is the Federal Reserve and the federal government have an overriding interest in keeping interest rates very low, partially because we'll have just massively increase in national debt, and the government doesn't want to have to pay a large debt service, so there's going to be tremendous pressure to keep interest rates very low, which encourages the building of capital goods like solar farms. So in the longer term, I think the information is the prospects are relatively good, but we want to be a little careful because that's for the electricity sector. And then I want to come back to the policy. We are going to be in a world where fossil fuels can be expected to be abundant forever. So when I, 25 years ago, started thinking about things like that, the prior model is we're going to run out of oil. And so we're going to need renewables because we're going to run out of oil. We need renewables to save the planet. We don't need renewables because we're going to run out of oil and natural gas. Second thing is, given the fact that we're going to be increasing national debt by $3 trillion, if that's an optimistic version, the pessimistic economy is more like 4 or 5, there's going to be no Green New Deal. I mean, let's just be honest. What scarce public resources are available are going to go to health and welfare. And if you heard the first panel, we do need to do a lot of testing. So between that and the solar farm, I know where we're going to make those decisions. And then at the private level, I also want to suggest that, sustainability in the US has been a luxury good. Rooftop solar, you may say, that's not a luxury good, but, to put out rooftop solar, you have to be a homeowner. Homeowner is correlated with wealth. Wealth is correlated with high income. So my sense of this is, again, this is a luxury good. When people's incomes are going to go down, they may think about other things. So we have some headwinds that we're going to be facing. But here's the good news. We're not going to go green electricity because fossil scarce. We're going to do it because green energy's costs are falling faster than the cost of fossil fuels. That's why we're going to do it. How's that going to happen? Is because people at Caltech and the Resnick Institute, things like the Solar to Everything initiative are helping us achieve that. So in the end, we have the same answer as the first panel. Science and engineering are going to save the day here. It's not going to happen out of economics because the economics essentially not really changing very much that balance between continuing to use the older fossil fuel plants and putting in new energy. It is actually going to come out of further cost reductions that are going to come out of the green energy.
Great.
So that's my little story.
Great. You started out getting me a little bit excited and optimistic about what was going to happen, and then you pulled the rug out from under us.
Sorry.
So Mike, thinking a little bit longer term, Jean-Laurent was talking about the economic changes and what we may or may not see coming in the short to medium term. How are attitudes towards climate change evolving during this time, and what are the longer term consequences of the pandemic in terms of the political action? Before the COVID pandemic hit, it seemed like climate change was finally getting more traction in US politics than it had before. Might that change, and what are the biggest unknowns at this point?
Well, I do think that we're in a very interesting situation where there is room for some optimism. And to be honest, change may not happen here in the United States. I'm optimistic that the sort of changes that Jean-Laurent was talking about are going to open the door for governments across the world to think about ways to be innovative and to think about ways to perhaps incentivize at this moment in time, with demand dropping, for oil and gas. That opens a really important window for policymakers throughout the world to try to incentivize investments in renewables. Now, again, I just said it may not happen here in the United States. We're in the midst of a really interesting presidential election cycle, to say the least, and we can talk a little bit more about that if we want. We're in a period in American politics of intense partisan polarization. And that's going to make it very difficult for any significant policy initiatives to move forward. Now, there's a number of scenarios that could play out come November, and then of course come January when the next administration takes office here in the United States. We could see that the current polarization continues in Washington, D.C. We could see one party or the other essentially take a clean sweep in Washington, D.C. At the outcome of this election. I learned in 2016 to not make predictions about who's going to win elections. And I have to tell you that this election cycle is so volatile that it's really impossible to know what will happen. But there is a good chance, again, there's a chance that come January, we could be in a situation where the partisan configuration in Washington might be amenable to further investment in renewables and in solving some of the climate change issues that we face. But I also do have to go back to something that Jean-Laurent said. We're going to be in, not only is the federal government going to be in having a massive debt crisis, but state and local governments are in desperate situations right now. Public finance throughout the country, and in fact throughout the world, is in a very serious crisis mode, and that is going to make it difficult for monetary incentives, at any level of government in the United States, to be invested in renewables and climate change solutions. So on the one hand, I'm kind of optimistic we could have we have an opening, but I think on the other hand, given the partisan divisiveness in the United States and the dire financial situation that the federal and state and local governments are in, it will be difficult for them to incentivize investment at least in the medium term. But moving off into the future, sorry, I took a little longer on that than I wanted to, but moving off into the future, right now, some of the polling data that's coming out is really somewhat positive, in my opinion. The Pew Charitable Trust and the Pew Research Center, just did some polling last month, and surprisingly enough to me, they did find. Oh, thank you. They did find, as you see in this first slide, it's not surprising that 79% of American adults who were polled in this survey, see that the spread of infectious diseases is a threat. That's at the top of all of our minds now. But global climate change still ranks very high as a threat that Americans see, to the United States. 60% of American adults agree that global climate change is a threat to the United States. And if you click to the next slide, what's also really, I think, important about this is that number has changed dramatically over time. It's crept up over the years. The Pew has been polling this since 2010. And that proportion of American adults who see climate change as a major threat to the US has continually crept up from 44% to 60%. Now, the downside, of course, is also what you see in the figure on the left, which is that when you break these data down by political party, we see that most of that increase that's occurred since 2010 has actually come from Democrats throughout the United States, who are increasingly worried about the threat that climate change poses to the United States. There hasn't been a lot of change on the Republican side, and so this increasing partisan divide is not just in Washington, D.C. It's throughout the country. And I think that's gonna represent, again, the sort of most difficult problem in the long run for serious efforts on the climate change front.
Okay. Well, so it means that we have the same trend going on now that we had before the virus started to affect us.
And I think that's a positive, right? Because I think, and again, it means that despite the this COVID pandemic is a horrible crisis that we're working through, but still, I think Americans do see that climate change is a very significant issue, and that is going to require some action in Washington, D.C. At some point soon when we can afford it.
Great. So how is this crisis similar or different from previous major economic, political, or health crisis? Are there parallels here that can help us define a path forward that addresses climate action for the post-COVID recovery period?
So so you can divide that into sort of like 3 or 4 different issues. One is during the crisis that we're in, and you can go back to our discussion in the first panel about testing, we either have a testing infrastructure before the crisis hit. It's really, really difficult to build that in weeks. We may be able to build it in months, but we can't. So there's a lot of stuff that now is given in how we're going to respond. So to some extent, you can think about the crisis, because it's been dealt with through this extremely intense social distancing, which at a scale of which I have no sense that a past experience has ever matched, has had this very large economic effect. So as Alice said in the last panel, the air is clear here, but the pictures across the world, you know, in India about the differences of the blue sky that you would find in Delhi, these are things that people are going to experience, and they're going to shift individual preferences. So we may not experience enough of that within the US to change the partisan divide, but the way when people see, you know, that there's a possibility to have clean air in the major cities of the world, they may actually start demanding things that are different from their politicians. And although they may not be able to deliver that in the next 2 or 3 years, that is going to become an incredibly more important part of the agenda, so that if you can think about the kind of energy portfolio that countries want to have, that is going to shift. And given the fact that the relative cost of delivering renewables versus non-renewables in a variety of different areas isn't very different anymore, that may be enough to shift the balance. We're not going to decommission coal plants that were built 10 years ago for a decade, unfortunately. But we may slow the building of new coal plants. We may decommission the old ones and replace them with renewables. So there may be a lot of ways in which this experience changes the way people think about this. And because the differences in costs are sufficiently close, that there is a tipping point there. You know, the other part that's very important that nobody's talking about right now, or very, very few people among economists, is what's the fiscal response going to be to this crisis? We have lived in a world of, you know, taxing labor, because Social Security, Medicare, income taxes are mostly labor taxes, and you know, we've had a rhetoric going back to Ronald Reagan, which is you can spur investment by reducing taxes on capital. We're super wealthy. We're very, very wealthy economies. So if we really want to do a lot of climate change, we're going to have to use capital taxes to do something, because there's not going to be a lot of income tax or stuff on income. We're going to be able to do something. And that's a response, you know, that you know, 19th century, all the crises in the 19th century, I've looked at cholera, I've looked at a bunch of stuff, there's never any fiscal response. At some point, you may build some infrastructure. So this is, let's go build some testing capabilities, not much of a fiscal response. Then you get World War I, World War II, the Great Depression. Those have really big fiscal responses, and they enable very large-scale government action. That question isn't even being thought about right now. So for us to even forecast what that's going to look like in January, as Mike was saying, is, you know, except for being sure that we'll be wrong, we're not going to say anything. At least I'm not. Maybe Mike will.
No, I'm not going to predict the election. But I will say, I think that's an important point. And I think that, you know, we're not thinking right now about the fiscal response. And that this is one of the ways in which I think this particular crisis differs from at least some of the ones in recent memory, like Katrina or 9/11. You know, those were important and very significant crises and important events in American history, recent American history. But they, I don't believe, led to the kind of fiscal response that we're likely to see that would operate across the entire United States. You know, the COVID epidemic is affecting everyone across the United States in ways that I don't think that Katrina and 9/11 did, in particular economically. So there is this opportunity, right, because of this potential fiscal response for very significant investment. I think the other thing that's different here is how, you know, again, when I think about Katrina or 9/11, you know, again, in those situations, there was a very, very big and very powerful policy response in Washington, D.C. What's really fascinating about the COVID crisis over the last, you know, 5 or 6 weeks has been how quickly state governors and states have acted, and how states themselves have taken on a lot of policy power. And even here in California, where Governor Newsom apparently has bought, I don't know what the number of the masks is, but he's made a major investment in purchasing masks for the state of California. And I think that might potentially, I mean, this potentially could signal a policy shift, a power shift between Washington, D.C. and state governments that again, when we're talking about renewables and climate change action, could signal that there might be some openings once we get out of the immediate crisis. Because again, states like California, with a governor who's now become very active and become a leader nationally, and maybe even internationally, he could carry forward that power and that agenda into other areas like renewables and climate change.
Well, that's great. Again, another nice optimistic or hopeful thought about what might be coming as a result of this. So let's look again even a little bit longer term and think a little bit more about some of those human behavior aspects. So what aspects of the shutdown and the eventual recovery that we see do you think could be used to spur human behavior towards more sustainable living? We heard Rob talking about one of the challenges related to the modeling efforts, that unlike physical modeling or modeling of chemical processes or a number of other things, modeling epidemiological issues involves a mixture of the technical response and the scientific response that comes from the work that we do, but also the behavioral and social aspects. How do we respond to the results of the models, and how does that change the way the models evolve? So as we think even further forward about how we're going to go into this recovery, how different could the post-COVID world look, and what do we need to do? What tools do we have in order to be able to enable that as we move forward?
Well, I'll tell you, I'll talk quickly about how I think the science has changed from a social science perspective, because in the first panel, they talked a little bit about how science is changing from their perspective. I really think that what's become very clear is that solving these kinds of problems, a global pandemic problem, is a problem that involves all science. It involves social science, it involves the natural sciences, it involves epidemiology, it involves medical sciences. And what again, I guess maybe I'm striking an optimistic tone, tonight, but what is really, I think, exciting to me about the research opportunities here are that they're very interdisciplinary, very cross-disciplinary. And in just the last 4 weeks or so, I've gotten involved in research collaborations on the COVID crisis that are with our computer scientists at Caltech, and that are with our neuro and social psychologists at Caltech. And we're doing some really innovative things that are very interdisciplinary and cross-disciplinary. We're taking advantage of this crisis opportunity to really try to put forward our interdisciplinary work to produce solutions to some problems. And I think that we're seeing that there's going to be a change in how science is done. And I do think that this push towards more collaboration is going to continue. Some of these other changes, I think it's going to be fascinating to see whether they're permanent or not. I do think that as Jean-Laurent's already pointed out, that the travel industry is going to be very slow to recover. And so I don't see that many of us are going to be, taking work trips. In fact, it may become, instead of, a lot of folks talking about, how many frequent flyer points they are and gloating over their frequent flyer status, that they may instead talk about how they're not traveling to conferences or they're not taking business trips, and in fact shifting a lot of those activities over to platforms like the one that we're using. So I do think that there's a lot of long-term shifts in behavior. It's just going to be fascinating to see how some of them play out.
So there's also the biggest sort of short-term impact on sustainability would be a rise in telecommuting, because we are one of the more energy, essentially, no net economic gain is if I drive 20 miles to get to work and I drive 20 miles to go home. And so if we could reduce that through telecommuting, so one of the issues that's interesting there historically is the rise of the factory, had to do with a centralized power source. We've gone away from that when we went from water power to electricity. But the other part of the factory was an enforcement of discipline among the workers, because you had to show up on time. You had a small amount of personnel that could be devoted to monitoring large numbers of workers for effort. And this was including in factories that were paying the piece rate. So factory discipline turned out to be important. If we go to a world in which there's a lot of telecommuting, how do we self-discipline? And we're very bad at self-discipline. I mean, people have all sorts of habits that they would like to kick, and they don't do that. And so the one thing that would be really interesting is how is the without sort of having a Marxist view of the opposition of capital and labor. But you could think about workers who would think that telecommuting would be better. They save a lot of time. And even if, now you'd probably not want to use public transport, so you'd rather avoid that. So, but can they get as much work done telecommuting than not? And the COVID crisis is a weird thing because on the one hand, it's forcing people to do this. On the other hand, you have a lot of things on your mind. You don't have childcare, right? There's a whole set of other things that make you unproductive. So that experience isn't quite the kind of knowledge that you would like to have, but enormous numbers of people will have experienced this. And that could be a sea change in the way we do things. At the same time, it'd be really interesting because it's bucking a trend of, in particular for high-skilled, innovative activities to become concentrated spatially across, within countries, Silicon Valley, New York City, Los Angeles, right? And to some extent, San Francisco has kind of done okay. Los Angeles is doing the worst in California, and we're still doing pretty well. But New York and other dense cities have been, hit very hard. So what are the lessons that we learned about how we reconfigure this economy? I'm somewhat hopeful that there'll be more telecommuting for large numbers of things where you can do things without much loss.
Right, and employers, including Caltech, have made massive investments in this technology, not just in terms of the technology itself, but also teaching us how to use it. For example, the online teaching that we're doing here at Caltech. And so I think that our, employers are going to be finding that there are going to be places where there are efficiencies that will arise because of the use of the technology. But I also agree with you that there are places where and we all know that in some ways we aren't maybe as efficient as we need to in certain situations, need to be, than we are when we're in person. So, I think this trend will continue. It's going to be interesting to see which industries and which kinds of businesses continue with this decentralized, remote learning and remote business. But I don't know, for example, what's going to happen at Caltech. It's going to be very interesting to see how we continue to integrate these technologies in the work that we do.
Well, and as Jean-Laurent pointed out, the fiscal response is still a sort of a big question mark. And in the last several of these major crises, we invested heavily in infrastructure, both after the Depression and the World Wars, and even in 2008, 2009, coming out of that, saw a huge increase in shovel-ready projects getting funded. So how we go about doing that financial support could affect a lot about how that infrastructure is built and how far away from our current set point we end up when we come back to reality. I think we're approaching the time where we should shift over to the audience Q&A section. So maybe we can have Xenia come back up. There she is.
Hello. Again, we got a lot of questions, so we'll try to get through the main themes as much as possible in the 11 minutes or a little bit less than 11 minutes that we have available to us. So you already talked about it somewhat. I just want to kind of touch on the subject again. And it's basically, if you can just summarize, what are the major tipping points for us to significantly accelerate the development of renewables? I mean, there are some technological issues like energy storage would be one of them that comes to mind. And if you can talk about it, not just from the point of view of what's happening in the US, but perhaps globally. And if you think, what are the natural leaders in this field? Is it going to be the United States? Is it going to be Europe? Other players?
So on that, I got involved in something. It seems to me that was in the pre-COVID world. I had a very simple solution to this, which is California should have a state level plan that's kind of like the creation of NASA to go to the moon, which is we want to essentially divide the costs of renewables possibly by a factor of 3 or something like that going forward, at which point it really doesn't matter what the cost of fuels is. People will just adopt renewables going forward. It's easier for thinking about oil. Natural gas is a complicated issue because it's somewhat of a byproduct of producing oil. So for oil, you could think about, Saudi Arabia is perfectly content to pump oil in an indefinite fashion at $15 a barrel. Most other producers are not. Fracking, lives okay at $50 to $60 a barrel. So you could think about that you know, as sort of the boundaries of where the oscillations of oil prices are going to be. At $15, at the 45 to 50 to $60 a barrel, renewables were very competitive last fall. So at that level, we were done. At $15 a barrel, they have a ways to go. They have lots of positive attributes that are not priced, like they don't pollute, right? Forget about the carbon, they don't pollute. And that's actually good. And so that's one. And then the other one is actually storage, which is you need storage and transmission because, you know, for those of us who have lived in places like London or Paris, solar panels on the rooftops of Paris are not going to produce a lot of power since it is dark almost all the time. Forget about Edinburgh or something like that. So we do have some bunch of technical things that we need to deal with. That's the R&D part. But you know, for the entire southern half of the United States, and then you can go all the way to the same latitudes on the other side of the equator, you know, renewables are easy. So we were on a really close to a tipping point. It's just now we have this sort of new race between the lower capital cost of serving the debt to build these things, and the competition from renewables. And you know, how close we are. Have we conserved that tipping point, or have we been pushed back? I don't know. And in the short run, we're not going to be building a lot of anything because we have excess capacity. But that's not going to last very long.
What about the collapsed, you know, oil prices?
Well, that was so it just happens to be when, you know, futures markets are always, they have a reference contract, which in this case was stuff to be delivered in a particular location. That market's really, really thin. So we tend to think about, you know, financial markets as really thick, like, you know, I can move $1 billion. You can't move $1 billion of almost anything. And so when lots and lots of people who had bought futures contract, because they expected to need these resources to do things like, think about airlines, right? They want to get out of these futures. They don't want to take delivery, right? But you want to force delivery on them because you're going to have to make them pay to not take delivery. And so these markets get unbalanced because they're so thin. You know, usually when these markets happens, it's the reverse. So there are these there's a main potato market corner. There's an attempt to corner the silver market. Prices shoot up because what you do is you control the supply and you force people to beg you to provide supply. In this case, it's the reverse. Demand was very controlled the market because these markets are very thin. So, you know, that could again happen in a month, although my intuition is people have learned their lesson and they're going to get out of these contracts on a more smooth fashion.
So just one other thing to say about the sort of the direction of potential future climate action in terms of the energy production is, if you think about our CO2 emission wedges, Jean-Laurent mentioned travel as a big area, and Mike talked about it as well. Here in California, and now actually all over the U.S., travel or transportation is the biggest carbon emitter of the different sectors. And so if we come out of this crisis with a different set point in terms of what we think is going to be happening in terms of travel, that may actually have a very big impact in terms of where we go and where we need to invest. As opposed to maybe what people were thinking about even just a few months ago. The other area is the hard to decarbonize sector. About 25% of the economy is making things like steel and cement and other heavy industry. And so if we start to invest heavily in manufacturing and infrastructure development here in the US in order to build our way out of the financial ramifications of this, that will sort of run counter to the attempts to try and reduce climate effects, unless we are faster with the innovation and coming up with carbon-free versions of some of these heavy industries that are some of the things we have the most need of new science and technology development to get to.
Great. Mike, do you want to add anything to this? Or
No.
Okay, great. So another set of questions that popped up was sort of looking at what is the prospect for interest and investment in R&D before COVID and after COVID in renewable technology? Do you think there is going to be potentially a shift towards more biomedical research away from, you know, renewable energy, or is there a risk there potentially?
Well, so it's a really complicated question because I don't know if you saw this when the sort of first, large bailout package came up, the Democrats were concerned about the fact that companies that engaged in stock buybacks. So we have a industrial corporate structure that is relatively heavily indebted because interest rates were very low. And so that pushed you to have a debt equity structure that had not much equity, lots of debt. And so you borrowed money to buy back your stock, which is exactly what you should do. It's what the model tells you to do. So it's the correct financial model. It has nothing to do with being bad to people. It's just literally interest rates are low, you should borrow lots of money, and you should buy your stock. And that's exactly what you should do. Of course, now that you have all this debt, it's more difficult to deal with a crisis because you have less buffer. So R&D budgets are going to go down, but they're going to go down for non-renewables as well. So there's going to be a lot less oil exploration in the next 5 or 6 years. How the venture capital industry emerges out of this is unclear to me. There will be more biomedical venture, but the problem is the people who are expert at biomedical venture tend not to do renewables. They're people with different expertise, different knowledge portfolios. And so my intuition is that there'll be less of that. The bigger issue is the government subsidy base for fundamental research, in these areas may not grow as quickly as it should. I'm somewhat optimistic that the research funding will not decline. It's so small potatoes relative to the budget that why bother with this? And it's an important piece of future prosperity. Most people agree with that. But are you going to get a big boost in Washington that you might have gotten otherwise? No, that's going to have to go to biomedical research. And not doing it would be politically expensive. Mike, what do you think?
No, I agree. Although I think that we also might want to consider that these aren't really separable necessarily, because research on issues like the COVID pandemic does touch upon, it may not touch upon directly on renewables itself and the investment in renewables, but it certainly touches on many of the larger issues associated with climate change. Globalization, international travel, human encroachment. A lot of these issues are issues that in some way, shape, or form are important when we think about climate change. So, I'm not entirely sure that I think of them as separable in those ways, because I do think that investment in public health and mitigating a lot of these climate change issues may also produce longer term solutions for future incidents of pandemics like this.
Maybe we could do one more.
Yeah, I think we had, let me see, I'm just trying to find something sort of along the same lines. So we already talked about the need to develop new technologies. So the scale up of carbon capture, for example, and how is that one of the, and along the lines of with energy storage, is it one of those tipping points that one needs to consider along the lines of implementing the renewables in the long term? I don't know if I'm making my...
That's a tough one. I think that's another tough question, right? You have to really have some kind of crystal ball to look and figure that one out.
My hope is that we educate our students. I mean, I think this is an issue where it's going to be really hard to get the political consensus in the next couple of years or 3 years to go back and harden carbon markets, which we should do. But the problem is, people are going to talk about jobs fleeing. So suppose you're going to harden carbon markets in California, people are going to worry about jobs moving to Arizona or some other part of the US or even outside the US entirely. And a global accord is going to be very, China and India, they're going to be concerned, we are rich, they're not that rich. They're going to be concerned about restarting their economy. They're going to be concerned about avoiding certain things, but they're going to be concerned with restarting their economy. So, despite the fact that I would like this, at this point, carbon capture is expensive. There's no market for it, and there's no consensus about how to create a market. That has been, if something's been knocked, something has been had a worse uphill climb, really, and that we really care about, it's that one.
Interesting. I'd say to sort of put a capstone on that and some of the themes that we've talked about at the end of this panel is, as a pedagogical lesson to take away from this is all of these issues around the development of new technologies that have the potential to make a huge difference in terms of the fight against climate change are coupled scientific and technical challenges and economic challenges and human behavior challenges. And one of the great things about being at a place like Caltech and working with folks like Mike and Jean-Laurent is that we're able to put those things together, as Mike was saying, is collaborations with the computer science faculty and the like, to put those things together from the beginning and understand that all of these things can be very much more complicated than we think they are from just the standpoint of developing the new technologies. And so with that, I think we are now at 6:01. So it is time to thank both of you, Mike, Jean-Laurent. That was a great conversation. Thank you so much for participating. And I'll turn it over to Diane.
Thank you, everybody, for joining us. We're so appreciative. As you leave tonight, there will be a brief survey that we encourage you to take. It just will help us to shape our future webinars going forward. Thank you again. We're so grateful to you for joining us tonight. Have a good evening.